Takže vážené dámy.
So, dear ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude this block of presentation by my remarks, follow up on my fellow speakers, and provide you with my personal view on how the National Bank of Slovakia is viewing on these issues. I may start with the more pleasant part, where we all agree on, and I do agree with what they were saying, speakers before me. The National Bank does agree with the fact that Slovak banking sector is a stable and healthy one. What does it mean? Mr. Vida actually put a name on it. It's a traditional model of banking. It's providing loans, deposits. It's a less risky business, which the Slovak banks are conducting. Of course, banks do operate in a risky environment. There are many risks which do have significant impact on banks during risky periods. So, despite the fact of applying prudent and safe banking model, banks are still exposed to risks of the external environment. These are quite pronounced. Recently, these have become more pronounced recently. That is why it's important, and national banks always viewed positively if banking sector was profitable, having above standard capital asset base. This profit the banks are producing is a supplementary source of capital protecting the bank before risks. So in this regard, that which banks don't like here, when we were saying this in our report, the banking sector had reached profit which in 2011 was high by 30%, 34% when compared to the previous year, which might have looked that it be above the average profitability of banks. That is positively viewed by the National Bank, but also we need to look how they use the profit. Recommendations we issued in January this year, we said that we would be glad if the banks, if they do not meet certain amount of capital, should they have a cushion, they should keep a certain cushion for the upcoming period for unexpected events. So that is beginning to show now, as the banking sector was quite well growing. Last year, in 2012, of the first quarter, we already have numbers, and the growth had slowed down by 1/5. By looking at the deeper analysis, what's been the cause of the slowdown, we found that the 90% of the decrease has been caused by the banking tax. And this is where we begin to go deeper into the problem, delving into what is the impact upon the Slovak banking by introducing new taxes. So sticking to my presentation, here we can see Slovakia on the graph, on the chart, which is 2011 data. I can tell you that due to the fact that the banking sector during 2011 and the first quarter 2012 strengthened its capital base, so the ratio is now 14%. The arrow of the red triangle of Slovakia is moved towards Czech Republic now, which is, from the viewpoint of the National Bank, a positive development. Now, looking at the banking contribution, we all know what's the government proposal debated last week going to the parliament. What the National Bank, in terms of this issue, is interested most is the stability of the banking sector. This bank contribution, in a way, makes impact upon the stability. We see two views here. One is positive, the other one is negative. Positive here is if the resources the bank contribution collects would be used for systemic risks. So it does matter for what purpose these funds be used in the future. Now the risks and negatives we see is most of all the weakening of attractiveness of the Slovak banking sector. Because one needs to realize these solutions are adopted at the national level. The banks operate cross-border. They operate internationally. These are all banks which operate throughout Europe within banking groups, even globally, meaning that if some of the countries, neighboring countries, have more attractive conditions, the parent company is looking at that and is evaluating how they're going to conduct the business in individual countries. We saw this with some banking groups which operate in Hungary and Romania, what's happening now in those countries. So the negatives here we see, and the National Bank sees them quite as substantial negatives, is the weakening attractiveness of banking sector for foreign owners and investors, and a very realistic impact could be weakening of loan activity, which is in the interest of the government for this not to decrease, so not to have to deleveraging as we can see in Western countries. Though the loan has not been growing as much over the recent months, but it's not been decreasing yet. So one of the main messages I'd like to give is important how we set this additional taxation, whether the rate would not exceed, negatives would not exceed the positives as a result. The purpose of collecting such type of tax or contribution should be creation of funds for systemic risks. Slovakia, however, is not a country where even one bank needed to be bailed out in the past. At this stage, yes, of the crisis, not a single bank needed to be bailed out. At the same time, I have to say, that doesn't necessarily mean that in the future this could not happen. It cannot be excluded in the future, and we remember in the past, which was 12, 14 years ago in Slovakia, there was a huge state bailout afforded 2-3 banks, and 4 additional banks went bankrupt. So looking at countries around us and perhaps further examples, some interesting examples here worth mentioning. For instance, if all entire banking sectors were failing in some countries, they were closely tied to the system of the state. For instance, in Ireland and Iceland, there was in a way a huge problems occurred, a failure of the entire state. So the banks do have strong impact on loan service, and as such they can cause bankruptcy of the state. Spain, for instance, had approached not introducing tax, banking tax, but they've introduced a high capital requirement, 19% for its biggest bank. This was done by Switzerland, by the way. And this capital requirement goes beyond of the capital requirement which is planned for CFIs within Basel III. So, if we spoke about the purpose of using these funds, we consider justified for such accumulation of sources to be determined for the future for, say, bailing out or recapitalizing banks in trouble. Now, the construction itself of this fund, of the bank tax, it should include or take into account for the tax to have a systemic significance, meaning that it's designed so that it would also express a systemic approach, thus being appropriately taxing all financial institutions equally. So one must not claim that it was also imposed on the passive part of banking concerning corporate business and retail. Now, the risk of unusually high tax, this was already mentioned. All I want to say is that it could lead to reviewing parent companies, banks reviewing their business in a given country. This could have a negative impact on the budget. If these problems were to continue, some banks getting into trouble, the parent banks not supporting them, and the state budget would have to bail them out because there would be no other option available anymore. So the risk of unusually high tax is here, definitely. As mentioned by Mr. Vida, highest tax today is in Hungary, but then 0.5%, but they've planned or announced it's decreased by 50% beginning next year. And they're moving on to the new financial transaction tax model. So really the threat is Slovakia will be #1 in Europe, having highest tax on banks. So it would be useful for this bank tax be temporary. So the law actually would provide for its being temporary. Now, concerning an impact on how profitability would develop in the banking sector with and without the tax, you can see nicely on the last two charts. Slovakia's banking sector profit without the bank tax, and with it you can see without is red column, and the green column, the last column, expresses the impact of this bank tax on profits. So you can see in 29 was profitability of banking sector was lower. The impact of the hypothetically modeled, of course, was a significant one. Profitability after making those deductions would be decreased drastically, reduced. As a result, there is our comment to this, aiming at that fact that this bank tax is not anti-cyclic. We see a negative impact on banks, specifically during low economic growth and low profitability of banking sector. Banks would, in fact, end up paying the same amount regardless of the profitability they have achieved. And here we have the numbers to support that. In 2009, it would be more than 75% of the sector's income. There, if a recession came about, the next negative factor comes in. Willingness of bank to provide loans would be lowered, threatening deleveraging. We've proposed alternative to this. So if there should be this type of tax, it should reflect this anti-cyclic feature, proposing a certain model which would be driven by GDP growth. So it would be progressive, based on or depending on GDP. There's just a model. I'm not saying it's the actual right model, but for the current level of contribution, which is 0.4%, would be rate only if the GDP growth was between 2 to 5%. So this is one comment on the cyclic feature, and then now let me mention last feature, and that is the introduction of ceiling up to the overall amount of profit realized by the given bank. We consider this justified, and based on the fact that the banks who realize a loss based on this draft act and based on the applicable act have to pay this tax, but the contribution of these small banks is negligible for the state budget. However, they have negative impact on the banks themselves by lowering resources of this bank. So these banks are then confronted with the problem of having to be recapitalized. Recapitalization, if bank is lacking capital, it usually takes place from the resources of the owners of the bank, but also it could happen that, as a paradox, entities who make this contribution, realizing loss at the end of the day, would be bailed out by the state and instead would have to use multiples of these amounts. So this is where we see also as a problem and contradiction with the basic thesis of collecting monies and funds from these banks. So this would conclude, maybe perhaps should be enough for the comments National Bank had made to the draft act currently going through legislative process. So this